On December, ice clung to the harbor railings as a patrol officer lifted a tarp from beneath a commuter bridge. Knotting frost sealed footprints that stopped abruptly. A single ring catching gray light. Evidence tag trembling in wind while radios went quiet, and the city held its breath together again. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Boston in 1992 was a city that carried its winters like a habit, learned and expected. A season that pressed people inward and slowed records rooms and court calendars alike. The discovery beneath the bridge did not present itself as spectacle. It arrived as a procedural interruption on a weekday morning, catalogued in ink that would dry slowly in the cold air of the precinct. The ring, photographed in place and then bagged, was white gold with a thin channel setting, sized for a small hand. It bore no inscription. The location was South Bay, near Dorchester Avenue, a stretch known to commuters and ignored by tourists, where traffic noise softened details and the tide erased most things it touched. The body nearby belonged to a young woman later identified as 22-year-old Kathleen O'Rourke, a recent college graduate living in Allston, home for Thanksgiving only weeks earlier, and expected at a family gathering on Christmas Eve that she never reached. Initial assessment focused on time and exposure. December temperatures had dipped below freezing several nights in a row, preserving clothing fibers and limiting insect activity, while tidal charts suggested the area had been reachable during low water late on a Sunday. The medical examiner noted hypothermia exposure patterns and blunt impact consistent with a fall or forced descent, but withheld cause pending toxicology. No obvious defensive wounds were present, no sign of prolonged struggle. Kathleen's purse was recovered several yards away, contents intact except for the ring found closer to the bridge abutment. That separation would matter later. For now, it established a perimeter and a timeline window of approximately 48 hours. Kathleen's disappearance had been reported by a roommate on December 7, after she failed to return from a late shift at a bookstore near Kenmore Square. Flyers printed on pale yellow paper went up in coffee shops and laundromats, the kind that curled at the corners when radiators ran too hot. Local papers carried a short item, cautious with adjectives, noting a missing young woman last seen wearing a dark coat and scarf. The case entered the holiday cycle when staff rotated leave and the city prepared for parades and end-of-year deadlines. Investigators kept moving. They canvassed bus routes, checked MBTA surveillance where available, and requested records from the store. A coworker confirmed Kathleen left alone, a little after 9, carrying a small gift bag for her mother. Snow had started earlier than forecast. The ring became the first fixed point. It was photographed, weighed, and compared against missing property lists. Family confirmed it was a Christmas gift from Kathleen's father the year before, worn daily. Its presence outside the purse suggested removal. That detail shifted the working theory from accident to criminal act without changing the tone of the paperwork. Detectives requested lab work for trace evidence on the band and the inner channel. Latent prints were partial and inconclusive, but fibers consistent with wool from a men's overcoat were noted. At the time, such fibers were common and not immediately probative. Still, they were logged. Interviews proceeded with care. Friends described Kathleen as methodical, cautious, a planner who called ahead. A former boyfriend was interviewed and cleared through alibi verification. He had been in New Hampshire with family for Thanksgiving and remained there into December. The roommate timeline was corroborated by phone records and building entry logs. No unusual calls appeared. Bank activity showed no withdrawals after December 6. The gift bag recovered later contained a scarf purchased the day before, receipt intact. The details accumulated without resolution. Autopsy findings, released mid-December, established cause of death as injuries sustained from a fall combined with cold exposure. The manner was undetermined pending investigation. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Toxicology returned negative for alcohol and common substances. The findings narrowed but did not close possibilities. The bridge was high enough to be lethal, but guardrails and barriers suggested assistance or coercion. Investigators reconstructed sightlines and traffic patterns, noting a narrow window when the area would be sparsely observed. Weather reports confirmed freezing rain that night, reducing pedestrian presence. Media attention intensified briefly before Christmas, then receded. The city moved on as cities do. The case file grew heavier then quiet. In January, detectives followed a lead involving a ride offered by a passing driver, but the description was vague and uncorroborated. Another tip suggested a bar patron argument, disproven by timestamps. The ring remained the anchor, a small circle of metal around which the facts revolved. Its lack of inscription limited tracing. Jewelers were contacted. Hundreds of similar rings had been sold. Years passed. The case was reviewed periodically, its box pulled from cold storage during December audits when the weather returned memories. In 2001, the department digitized portions of the evidence catalog. The ring was rephotographed with higher resolution. New techniques allowed more sensitive fiber comparison. The wool fibers were matched more precisely to a specific mill pattern, narrowing potential coat brands sold regionally in the early 1990s. Still without a suspect, it remained context. The breakthrough came quietly in 2009, when a retired transit worker submitted a statement during a routine integrity review, prompted by a newspaper anniversary piece. He recalled assisting a distressed man near South Bay on the night in question. A vehicle stalled, a coat matching the fiber profile. He had not come forward earlier, believing the situation resolved. Investigators located maintenance logs and cross-referenced traffic citations. A name emerged: Thomas Gallagher, 34, in 1992, a warehouse supervisor with a record of minor assaults. He owned a sedan sighted near Dorchester Avenue that winter. Gallagher was interviewed under caution. He denied involvement, placing himself elsewhere. Records contradicted parts of his account. A search warrant obtained lawfully recovered an old overcoat from storage, fibers consistent with those on the ring. Advances in touch DNA allowed testing of skin cells recovered from the inner channel of the ring. The profile matched Gallagher. The probability calculations were presented conservatively, meeting evidentiary standards. The case proceeded deliberately. Prosecutors reconstructed the timeline, establishing opportunity and motive tied to an attempted robbery gone wrong. Witnesses testified to Gallagher's presence and vehicle. In 2012, a jury returned a guilty verdict for second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life with parole eligibility under the statutes applicable at the time. Kathleen's family attended quietly, winter coats folded on their laps. Afterward, the bridge remained a bridge. The ring was returned to the family. Each December, the file is cited in training as a study in patience and procedure, a reminder that cold preserves more than evidence, and that resolution can arrive long after the city has stopped watching. By the time the calendar turned, and the harbor thawed into a dull gray sheen, the investigation entered a phase familiar to veteran detectives, a phase defined less by action than by maintenance. Evidence was checked in and out, reports were read again, and assumptions were tested against the slow pressure of time. Kathleen O'Rourke's name moved from the active board to a binder marked unsolved, not as surrender, but as a recognition of reality in a city where homicides competed for attention and resources. Winter receded, then returned, and each December the case resurfaced in briefings, an obligation carried forward by officers who remembered the ring and the quiet way the scene had presented itself. The early years produced incremental work. Analysts re-examined the bridge structure, measuring rail heights and distances, comparing them with incident reports of accidental falls. The data suggested rarity. Engineers consulted by investigators confirmed that an unassisted fall was unlikely without deliberate climbing. That conclusion did not accuse anyone, but it refined the narrative. Detectives requested additional canvassing of the area's late-night businesses from 1992, many of which had closed. Records were thin. Employees had moved. Memory degraded. Still, the file grew marginally clearer around its edges. Kathleen's life was documented carefully. She had grown up in a South Shore town, attended a state university, and worked part-time while applying to graduate programs. Friends described routines anchored by responsibility. Phone bills showed long calls to family during Thanksgiving week. A postcard mailed on December 3 spoke of cold weather and plans for Christmas dinner. None of this explained how she came to be beneath a bridge, but it established a baseline that investigators trusted. The purse, examined again in 1995, yielded nothing new. Its contents suggested no theft beyond the ring. Cash remained. Cards were unused. That pattern reinforced the theory of an interrupted encounter rather than premeditated targeting. Investigators considered the possibility of a spontaneous robbery, a brief confrontation escalating under the cover of winter darkness. Such crimes were common enough to be plausible and rare enough to be difficult to trace without witnesses. Media interest waned and returned in cycles. On the 5th anniversary, a local paper ran a measured retrospective, quoting police statements and urging anyone with information to come forward. Tips arrived and were logged. Most were unhelpful. A few suggested individuals already cleared. Each tip was handled, each caller thanked. The process mattered, even when outcomes did not. Technological change altered the landscape. In the late 1990s, DNA databases expanded. The evidence from the ring had been preserved with foresight, stored under conditions that allowed later testing. When touch DNA techniques matured, the case qualified for reanalysis. Funding approvals took time. Paperwork moved through committees. The work resumed not with drama but with lab requisitions and chain of custody reviews. Meanwhile, investigators tracked patterns in similar cases statewide, searching for overlaps. None emerged. The absence of a serial signature was itself information, suggesting an offender whose act was isolated. That conclusion aligned with the evidence, which pointed toward opportunity rather than obsession. It also narrowed the pool in a way that statistics alone could not. Kathleen's family remained present without pressing. They attended annual meetings, listened, asked questions grounded in reason. Their restraint influenced the tone of the investigation, keeping it steady and focused. Holidays were the hardest. Each Thanksgiving brought calls from reporters, each Christmas a brief note from the department. The rituals persisted. The transit worker's memory, when it surfaced years later, did not arrive as a confession or a headline. It came as a form filled out in careful handwriting, attached to a routine review prompted by an anniversary article that had jogged recollection. The statement described a stalled vehicle, a man frustrated, the weather unpleasant. The detail that caught investigators' attention was not drama but specificity. The location, the time window, the coat. It fit without forcing. Verification followed. Maintenance logs placed the worker there. Traffic citations placed the vehicle nearby. The name associated with the car had appeared nowhere in the file. That absence mattered. It suggested a gap rather than redundancy. Investigators approached cautiously, aware of the dangers of retrofitting memory. They sought corroboration independent of the statement. They found some. Thomas Gallagher's history was unremarkable until examined closely. Employment records showed stability punctuated by terminations for temper. Police records showed minor assaults, none prosecuted as felonies. He lived within driving distance. He had no connection to Kathleen that could be established. That lack of connection aligned with the theory. The interview conducted with Gallagher years later was procedural. He acknowledged being in the area occasionally, denied specifics, offered an alibi that placed him elsewhere. Investigators tested the alibi against records. Inconsistencies emerged. Not contradictions, but gaps. The law allows for gaps. It does not allow for fabrication. The warrant application was detailed. It cited the ring, the fibers, the statement, the vehicle records, and the inconsistencies. A judge approved it. The search produced the overcoat, stored and forgotten. Its fibers matched the refined profile. The match was not singular proof, but it strengthened the chain. The DNA results arrived with the restraint appropriate to their power. The profile from the ring's inner channel matched Gallagher. The statistics were conservative, the language careful. Prosecutors reviewed, consulted, and decided to proceed. The charge reflected the evidence and the era. The trial years later unfolded without spectacle. Evidence was presented in sequence. The ring was shown, its simplicity underscored. Experts explained fibers and probabilities. The transit worker testified to his memory, framed by documentation. The defense challenged timelines and recollections. The jury listened. When the verdict came, it did so quietly. There were no outbursts. Sentencing followed statutory guidance. Kathleen's name was read into the record. The ring returned to the family, closed a loop that had remained open through many winters. In the aftermath, the department updated its training materials. The case illustrated the value of preservation and patience. It showed how a small object could carry years of weight. The bridge remained unchanged, traffic flowing, seasons turning. The file was closed but not forgotten. Its lessons carried forward each December when cold air sharpened memory and procedure proved its worth. The years following the conviction did not erase the long quiet that had defined the case, but they altered its meaning within the department and the city. Records that once gathered dust became reference points, cited in internal reviews and academy lectures as examples of evidence preserved beyond expectation. The ring, now back with Kathleen O'Rourke's family, existed no longer as an exhibit number, but as a private artifact, its significance shifting from proof to memory. For investigators who had worked the file, closure did not arrive as relief so much as a recalibration, an understanding that patience had been justified. Administrative follow-up continued after sentencing. Appeals were anticipated and prepared for. Transcripts were reviewed line by line, exhibits rechecked for compliance. The conviction withstood scrutiny. Appellate courts affirmed the findings, noting the careful accumulation of independent evidence and the absence of procedural error. The case's longevity became part of its strength, demonstrating restraint rather than urgency. The legal outcome settled into permanence. Public response was muted, fitting the tone of the case itself. Local papers ran brief summaries when appeals concluded, noting the passage of time and the role of new forensic techniques. There were no editorials demanding reform, no calls for spectacle. The story entered the city's archive as one among many, distinct only for its patience. For a population accustomed to winter endurance, that quality resonated. Kathleen's family marked holidays differently after the case closed. The absence remained, but the uncertainty lifted. Thanksgiving dinners resumed their shape, conversations allowed to drift without the undercurrent of unresolved questions. Christmas mornings carried quiet acknowledgments rather than dread. These changes did not make headlines, but they mattered. The justice system rarely measures its success in such terms, yet they represent its intended effect. Within the department, the case influenced evidence handling protocols. Storage conditions were standardized further. Documentation practices were refined. The lesson was not technological optimism but discipline. Had the ring been mishandled, the later DNA work would have been impossible. Had the fibers not been logged precisely, their later comparison would have lacked context. These details were emphasized repeatedly, especially to younger officers for whom the early 1990s already felt distant. The bridge at South Bay underwent routine maintenance in subsequent years. Guardrails were reinforced, lighting improved. None of these changes were attributed publicly to the case, but they reflected broader safety assessments. Commuters crossed daily without knowledge of the history beneath. Urban spaces absorb events and continue. Investigators understand this continuity as both obstacle and necessity. Periodic audits of cold cases continued. Some yielded results, others did not. The O'Rourke file remained closed, its resolution cited as encouragement rather than expectation. Not every case benefits from preserved evidence or a late emerging witness. The department resisted simplistic narratives about technology solving all problems. The truth was more conditional. It required preservation, memory, and a convergence of circumstances. Training sessions revisited the case with emphasis on chronology. Recruits were asked to consider how small decisions in 1992 shaped outcomes decades later. The decision to photograph the ring in situ. The choice to preserve fibers despite their apparent commonness. The restraint in public statements that avoided contaminating memory. These were not dramatic moments, but they were decisive. The city's seasonal rhythms framed these discussions. December audits, year-end reporting, winter staffing challenges. The same conditions that once complicated the investigation now provided context for reflection. The holidays, with their emphasis on tradition and continuity, mirrored the slow arc of the case itself. Time did not heal the harm, but it allowed process to function. Thomas Gallagher remained incarcerated, his case cited in parole reviews with reference to the severity of the offense and the evidence supporting conviction. There were no public statements from him acknowledging responsibility. The system proceeded as designed, balancing punishment and procedure. For the family, this aspect mattered less than the affirmation of facts established at trial. Community memory of Kathleen faded gradually, preserved mostly within family circles and departmental records. A scholarship established in her name at her alma mater continued quietly, supporting students pursuing social services. Its existence reflected her interests rather than her death. Such gestures resist reduction to case numbers. On anniversaries, investigators who had worked the file sometimes exchanged brief messages, noting the date and the weather. These acknowledgments were not formal, but they marked professional respect for a case that demanded endurance. The city's cold, once an adversary, became a reminder of preservation. Winter had slowed decay, extended timelines, and kept options open. The broader implications of the case extended into policy discussions about cold case funding. Administrators cited it when advocating for resources dedicated to evidence preservation and periodic review. Legislators listened selectively. Budgets shifted incrementally. The case did not transform systems overnight, but it contributed to a gradual recalibration of priorities. As years passed, new technologies emerged and older cases were reassessed under different standards. The O'Rourke case remained stable, its conclusion secure. Stability is an underappreciated outcome in criminal justice, achieved through adherence to process rather than innovation alone. It provided a counterpoint to narratives of sudden breakthroughs. The family's decision to limit public engagement after the case closed influenced its legacy. There were no documentaries produced immediately, no extended interviews. This restraint preserved dignity and prevented distortion. When the case was later referenced in training materials or academic discussions, it retained its measured tone. The winter of 2012, when the verdict was delivered, passed into memory like others. Snowstorms disrupted schedules, harbor ice formed and melted. The city continued. For those connected to the case, that continuity was itself a form of resolution. Life did not pause, but it incorporated the truth. In reflecting on the investigation, supervisors emphasized the absence of shortcuts. Each step adhered to standards, each inference supported by evidence. The temptation to speculate was resisted. This discipline protected the case from collapse under appellate scrutiny and preserved its integrity. The ring's journey from gift to evidence to heirloom encapsulated the case's arc. Objects acquire meaning through context. In this instance, the context was built patiently, layer by layer, across decades. The result was not dramatic revelation but confirmation. As another December approached years later, a training officer concluded a session by reminding recruits that most cases do not announce their importance. They appear ordinary, even quiet. What distinguishes them is how they are handled when attention fades. The O'Rourke case served as proof that careful work endures. The quiet aftermath continued, unremarkable to outsiders but significant to those involved. The case remained solved, its resolution integrated into the city's record. Winter returned, as it always did, carrying with it the understanding that time, when met with discipline, can still serve justice. In the final years after the appeal process ended, the O'Rourke case settled into its permanent place within Boston's institutional memory. The file was no longer marked active, but it remained accessible, its contents organized and preserved with deliberate care. Detectives retiring from service signed their names in a transfer log, acknowledging responsibility passed forward. Each signature represented continuity rather than closure. The case no longer demanded action, yet it continued to instruct. It reminded those who encountered it that resolution does not always arrive quickly, and that justice often advances through accumulation rather than revelation, especially when seasons and decades intervene. The courthouse where the verdict had been delivered changed little over time. Marble steps wore smooth beneath countless shoes, clerks rotated through offices, and records were stored in climate-controlled rooms far from public view. Kathleen O'Rourke's name appeared in the docket only once more, when the final appeal was formally denied. After that, silence followed. For the legal system, silence signified completion. The matter had been argued, weighed, and resolved within the boundaries of law. No further motions were filed, no extraordinary remedies sought. The record stood as final. For law enforcement, the aftermath involved reflection rather than ceremony. Supervisors reviewed the investigation during annual evaluations, highlighting adherence to protocol and restraint in public communication. Younger officers, some not yet born in 1992, studied the timeline with detached focus. They noted how winter conditions influenced evidence preservation, how patience prevented missteps, and how minor details, once recorded, retained value long after their relevance seemed exhausted. These lessons were absorbed quietly, becoming part of professional habit rather than doctrine. The neighborhoods surrounding South Bay continued their ordinary rhythms. Traffic patterns shifted as new developments rose, but the bridge remained a functional structure, serving commuters unaware of its history. Urban memory is selective, shaped by repetition rather than singular events. The absence of a visible marker allowed the location to resume anonymity. This was not neglect but acceptance, an acknowledgement that places cannot carry every story indefinitely. The case lived instead in records, classrooms, and the memories of those directly affected. Kathleen's family maintained privacy, declining invitations for public retrospectives. Their decision shaped the case's legacy, preserving its factual integrity. Without dramatization, the narrative remained anchored in procedure and evidence. Friends who had once spoken to reporters moved forward with their lives, carrying private recollections unaltered by retelling. The absence of spectacle ensured that Kathleen was remembered as a person rather than a symbol, a distinction valued by those closest to her. Each December, internal audits revisited long-term evidence storage. Technicians checked seals, verified logs, and confirmed conditions. The ring was no longer present, but its documentation remained exemplary. The process honored the principle that evidence must be protected regardless of immediate utility. Administrators cited the case when defending budgets for preservation facilities, arguing that justice sometimes depends on decades-old decisions. These arguments were practical rather than philosophical, grounded in demonstrated outcomes. The solved status of the case influenced how unsolved files were prioritized. Investigators approached dormant cases with renewed discipline, avoiding assumptions about inevitability. Not all cases advanced, but each received careful review. The O'Rourke investigation served as a reminder that time can be an ally if work is done correctly. It discouraged shortcuts and reinforced the value of documentation that anticipates future scrutiny. Public interest resurfaced briefly on significant anniversaries, usually prompted by general discussions of cold cases rather than specific demand. When mentioned, the case was summarized accurately, its resolution presented without embellishment. The tone mirrored the original investigation, measured and restrained. This consistency protected the integrity of the outcome and reinforced public trust. The absence of controversy allowed the focus to remain on process rather than personality. Within the correctional system, Gallagher's incarceration proceeded under routine oversight. Parole reviews considered statutory guidelines and the seriousness of the offense. No extraordinary factors altered his status. The system functioned predictably, reflecting the stability of the conviction. For the family, this predictability mattered. It ensured that the resolution would not be reopened unpredictably, allowing them to move forward without renewed uncertainty. As years passed, the case gradually receded from active discussion. New investigations demanded attention, new challenges emerged. Yet the file remained intact, its lessons embedded within institutional practice. When referenced, it was done so with respect for its complexity and the discipline it required. The case did not promise hope where none existed, but it demonstrated possibility grounded in method. The seasonal frame that once complicated the investigation became symbolic in retrospect. Winter, with its capacity to preserve and conceal, had shaped both the crime and its resolution. Investigators learned to account for environmental factors not as obstacles but as variables. This understanding informed subsequent work, particularly in cold weather jurisdictions where similar conditions prevail. The case contributed quietly to broader professional knowledge.